Hey you guys, this is Professor Vitt, and in this module we are going to be talking about science. At this point in the course you've realized that anecdotes, stories, aren't really very good, right? It seems like for various reasons, if we rely only on anecdotes, we don't end up with the maximum number of true beliefs. So we're going to talk now about science. And the approach that I'm going to take to science is to rewind us for a little bit back to medieval times, around the 1600s, because I want to give you some indication of how our worldview is now different as a result of science. So in the 1660s, the Duke of New Brunswick was having someone tortured. And what he asked was a couple of Jesuit monks to come and supervise the tortures. This individual was put on a rack and pulled. It's an extraordinarily painful and very gruesome practice. It's something that hopefully never appears in the history of the world ever again. But the Duke said, look, I want you guys to go in there and make sure that the inquisitors are really doing a good job, right? Make sure that the people that they're arresting and they're torturing are only the people who have been implicated by the confession of other witches. And so the two monks say, absolutely, let's go do it. So what happens is, before you read this, he takes the two monks to the torturing, and they watch this individual on the rack, and they say, yes, these inquisitors are doing their duty. They're only arresting people who've been implicated by other confession. So the Duke then decides to demonstrate to them, you know, how unlikely this seems. And so what he does is he goes to the person being tortured and he says, I suspect these two men of being warlocks, meaning the two priests who were there to supervise the torture. What do you say? Another turn of the rack. So they turn the rack again. It pulls someone farther apart. It's very painful. And the person who's on the rack responds. It's a female. And she says, no, right? You're quite right. I have seen them at the Sabbath. They can turn themselves into goats, wolves, and other animals. Several witches have had children by them. One even had 8 children whom these men fathered. The children had heads like toads and legs like spiders. Now, to us modernly, this seems kind of silly, right? If you cause someone enough pain, they're going to tell you almost whatever you want to hear. But at the time, this was fairly revolutionary. I mean, people hadn't thought about this. This was traditionally considered a reliable way to extract a confession from somebody. Now, this took place in the 1600s, and the idea here was that we're moving away from just relying on someone's word, right? Just relying on a fanciful tale for something, and instead, for claims that seem a little bit more important, people start demanding evidence for them. So now I'm going to fast forward a little bit here, a little bit further into the modern era, and I'm going to talk about this guy, Franz Mesmer. Now, I'm not going to ask you dates on Franz Mesmer or locations or anything like that. But what I want you to know is that in the 1770s, early 1770s, Franz Mesmer, this guy here on the left, was super famous in European circles, in particular in European courts, for a sort of magical power that he had. He would put people under a spell, right? He would, this is where the word comes from, mesmerize them. And he would activate these energies in their bodies. And there are lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of reports of people reacting to Mesmer's trance erratically. They would go into fits, they would pass out, this kind of thing. And he developed a huge following. And the idea was something about Mr. Mesmer was magical or paranormal. He could somehow excite the humors or the spirits of a person. And among some of his big fans, people that we would know today, Mozart thought that Mesmer was really onto something, and Marie Antoinette also thought that Mesmer was onto something, and he was a very important figure. Well, Marie Antoinette's husband, King Louis XVI, did not think that Mesmer was Louis XVI didn't think that Mesmer was all that. So Louis XVI appointed a panel of people to investigate Mesmer and his claims. So among the members that he appointed were Antoine Lavoisier, the Paris mayor Jean Bailly, I think that's pronounced right, it may not be, Dr. Guillotine, and America's own Ben Franklin. So what they did was they had these signs. By the way, this is before I go on, I should mention this. Ironically, both Lavoisier and Bailey were killed by Dr. Guillotine's device later in the same decade. But I digress, right? Just quite aside from the point. What they did was they took one of Mesmer's agents. Mesmer himself didn't go to this. He sent one of his agents. And historically, that's probably because Mesmer knew he was on the chopping block. So if he was proven to be a fraud, then he could always say, well, that was my agent, not me. But if it was successful, he could still say, well, this is my agent. Okay, so this is what they did. They wanted to check and see whether or not Mesmer had any powers. Could he charge things with energies, and then those things that were charged would affect people in a noticeable way. So what they did was they took Mesmer's agent and they brought him into a backyard and they showed him a number of trees. And they told him, okay, you charge one of those trees. So Mesmer's agent did. And then they started to walk a blindfolded boy, after the tree had been charged, into the yard to see if the boy could detect the charged tree. Now, supposedly he should be able to, because again, remember Mesmer, when he would charge something or excite these energies within a person, people would pass out, they would convulse, so on and so forth. Well, what Franklin did was they charged one tree, and then they brought the boy back there and said, okay, which tree did we charge? And so as he began to walk around, he encountered one of the trees, and then started experiencing all kinds of spasmic fits, and he passed out, and that was it. Well, the boy had passed out and experienced all these fits when he encountered a tree that was not charged by Mesmer's agent. And so when that happened, the panelists said, oh, the power of suggestion is probably what's to be accounted for here. In other words, the charge that was supposed to be on the tree wasn't, and the kid didn't detect it, and he actually got a false positive. He got a tree that wasn't charged, and he thought that it was. Now, you may say, you know, okay, big deal, who cares? But think about our prior example with the monks, where we were relying only on somebody's word for it, only on somebody's personal anecdote. This is a case where people are investigating a claim, but they're not relying on some anecdote for it. Instead, what they're trying to do is to determine whether or not there's some phenomena that exists independently of someone claiming that there's this phenomena. And this is a huge shift in thinking as a species, right? We're moving away from testimonies, and we're moving towards evidence that we can all apprehend and see and touch and inspect. So Mesmer gets debunked. Now, he actually ends up doing pretty well throughout the rest of Europe, and he goes on and still has something of a career of his own. Okay, so this is a general overarching point. Science has greatly improved the quality of our lives. Take, for instance, the shirt I'm wearing. It's actually a blend. And we wouldn't have been able to manufacture this shirt unless we understood enough science from the petrochemical era to know, what compounds, when they're combined, would, be good for clothing, right? We couldn't use the sewing machines that we've built because we wouldn't be able to extract the ore from the earth and pour it into molds and so forth, right? If you look at almost any aspect of your life, it's been made better by science. Now, it's true that much of that betterment comes from technology, right? So some of what makes my life great is that I can drive in a cool car and I can traverse a distance in an hour that, people couldn't traverse in weeks otherwise, right? I mean, depending on the terrain. And so it's important to remember science is good. We like it. Science is good. It's been the most successful way to produce knowledge about the external world that we've ever encountered, right? Nothing else is close in that sense. But I don't want you to think that science is everything. I mean, as good as science is, it's not going to do everything for you. So I'm going to run through some of these. So generally speaking, science is great because it's produced a profound amount of knowledge about the world for us, but it's not going to do everything for us. So I'm going to mention some of these things. Now, when I say science, what do I mean? Here's a great definition for it. It's also in the notes. A system that creates, builds, and organizes knowledge in the form of testable explanations and predictions about the universe. And this is a huge thing, right? Instead of relying on anecdotes for truth, science tends to prefer evidence which is open to inspection. And by that we mean evidence that can be reproduced by other people elsewhere. We don't have to take anybody's word for it. We can investigate these things for ourselves. Now, that much being said, science isn't perfect. It has some problems. First of all, science has a publication bias. What does that mean? It means people, like anyone, want to be recognized for their hard work. And so there's a push for people to want to publish and publish a study that is fantastic and groundbreaking. And this is because they're professionals and they want that reputation to accrue to them. Also, you have journals who publish these studies, and those journals don't want to publish a study that doesn't have a fantastic result. It's really tough to walk up to, say, the Journal of Nature and say, hey, we got funding for a $5 million study. We did everything. By the way, it shows nothing. There's absolutely no connection between these two things, but we'd like for you to publish it. Well, that's not, it's not likely going to be accepted over another study that does show some interesting connection. So you have to be careful, right? And particularly in light of past cases of fraud from science. So years ago, there was a duo, and they had claimed that they had perfected something called cold fusion, which would be a revolution in energy. And it wasn't true, right? It was fake, it was fraud. And this happens over and over again in science. You have people who make claims that end up being fraudulent. It doesn't mean that science isn't good or great. It doesn't mean that science isn't even the best game in town. But what it does mean is you have to look out. It's not going to be absolutely perfect all of the time. Also, science is relatively narrow in the answers that it can give to you. Science can't tell you what the meaning of life is. There's no test for that. Science can't tell you what the best Star Wars movie is. It's Empire Strikes Back. Science can't tell you how to live your life, right? It can't tell you what clothes to wear, what music to listen to. So science can't answer everything. I mean, it's great, but it has a limited focus. And remember, as science is progressing, as it's moving along, it's going to be wrong. And you're going to have cases where there's disagreement among experts and within a community. So, the next thing I want to point out about science is that it has been wrong in the past, and I assure you it will be wrong again in the future on some point. And that's because of how science works. Science is built on error. In other words, I'm a scientist. I want to prove a relationship between salt and heart disease. So, right, I do some study, and I publish my study. And the very first thing that we do, or I submit my study to a journal, is that it gets reviewed by a panel of experts who work in this field, ideally. And they say, well, it looks like this is good. There are some problems here on your protocol, right? The way you're running the experiment isn't right. Or it looks like you weren't sufficiently rigorous in keeping track of your data. Whatever it is, you submit a journal or a study, and then people try to tear it apart. The whole point of science is to try and disprove things, right? And in that sense, science is built on error, and it will give you different answers at different times. Look at the history of geology, and you'll see it's a history of people learning more about the universe and how old the Earth is. And there are estimates that change over time as to how old the Earth is. it does not mean that the Earth is suddenly, or that science is totally wrong because it changes its mind on how old the Earth is. It means that science revises its claims on the basis of new evidence. And I remember once I had a student say something like, well, look, I mean, you look at the Bible, and the Bible is always right. It always says one thing about the age of the Earth. And then you look at science, and it changes its mind over and over and over and over again, right? And the student's impulse was to say, gosh, which is correct? Well, on some level, this is a false distinction, but what it does point out is the difference here between different kinds of knowledge. Science is going to be wrong. It's not anything that's wrong with science that it revises its claims. It would be inappropriate to not revise your claims if you got new evidence. So remember that about science. It doesn't deliver certainty, it doesn't give you absolute knowledge, and it doesn't tell you how to live your life. It's built on error, and it doesn't technically prove anything. It just shows things that aren't false. So generally speaking, yay science, we love it. But we have to be careful because we don't want to misplace that trust. We don't want to put too much confidence in these results if it's not warranted. Science isn't itself really a body of knowledge, but it's more a system or a method that involves assumptions. So I'm going to talk about one of the principal assumptions in science first. It's called naturalism. And then I'm going to talk about two different forms of naturalism. Naturalism is the claim that events in the world are publicly available, measurable, and can be studied methodically. So you can see this diagram right here. Here we go. Of the box and then, you know, like the universe or something. The way to think about it is, suppose that the universe is inside the box. In that case, naturalism says, hey, the only thing that's real is what's inside this box, right? We don't know anything else that's in the box or outside of the box. There could be something outside of the box, but we don't know. We're just going to say what's publicly available, what can be measured, all that stuff has to be natural. It has to be within the universe, and it needs to be accessible to us. So naturalism says the universe is a box and there's nothing outside the box, right? What's real is in the cosmos, the physical universe. We don't know about anything else. And so the naturalist says, look, there's nothing outside, or at least there's nothing outside in the sense that we can't test whether there's something outside of the universe. The universe is itself everything. And so, you know, it's hard to say that we're going to get outside of everything to see if there's something more. Right? It doesn't seem to work. But there are different ways that you can cut up this sort of restricting the scope of what's real to what's inside the box. Okay, the first form of naturalism we're going to talk about is called methodological naturalism. It sounds very fancy. All it means is, for the purposes of doing science, we're going to assume that the events in the world are publicly available. So if you can see, smell, hear, touch, all this stuff, you're going to be able to see this stuff. They are publicly measurable. Anybody can go out with a stopwatch or a ruler and measure these events. And we can systematically study this, right, this stuff. We can study events in the world, and we can study the world itself. Now, this is different than philosophical naturalism. Philosophical naturalism makes the claim that there are events in the world that are publicly available, measurable, and can be studied methodically. It's asserting the claim. In methodological naturalism, you're just kind of assuming this for purposes of doing sciences. You're not really making any claims. You're just assuming that the physical universe is the only one that we see. Philosophical naturalism says, no, I am making the claim that the only thing that's real is what is the natural world, right? The universe that we can observe. Now, do you remember this slide? It's from a couple of lectures ago. And it had to do with whether or not you were a physical substance or also a spiritual one. It was in the lecture involving the brain, and we made an assumption for this class. And the assumption was You are your brain. In other words, who you are can be located inside your brain. We just assumed it for purposes of the class because remember, it helped us to explain why our brain takes funny shortcuts, right? Why do we have these funny little bizarre biases and errors that occur, right? Remember the circles that look bigger or shorter, and we had all these examples of things. Why does our brain do that? Well, our brain does that because it's taking shortcuts. It's taking shortcuts because it consumes so much energy, right? Our brain takes up 20% of the calories in our body. So it needs to take a break. It needs to get some relief somewhere, so it takes shortcuts. Remember? Okay. The point of that, but we did say, so we said, look, in order to learn the material, we're going to assume that you're a brain-dependent mind, meaning who you are is just your brain. But remember, there was a difference here between theory and practice. And we sort of talked about, let me see if we've got the slides. No, but that's okay. You may also be a spiritual substance, right? Lots of people think this. Lots of philosophers think this. They say, look, I'm not just the brain. I'm also some type of non-physical thing. Maybe you'd call it a soul or a mind or a spirit, whatever your terminology is. Some people say it's not just that the natural world exists, right? There's also a spiritual world or a non-physical world, if you will. But remember, we didn't make a claim about that. We said, we're just going to assume that you're your brain. It may turn out differently. You may not just be your brain. It could be a soul or something too, right? But for purposes of the class, for learning the material, we're just going to assume that you're the brain because it helps us learn. The same thing happens with methodological naturalism and philosophical naturalism. Methodological naturalism, notice that word method in there, is used to do science, right? So think about a scientist, right? Scientist Juanita walks into her lab and she's going to test DNA in chicken embryos or something like that. When she walks into the lab, she assumes that what she's testing will take place within the proteins of the DNA, and that's it. In other words, she doesn't think that there are going to be gremlins that are going to sneak in and alter the DNA, right? There are no gremlins in her hypothesis, right? It's just a discussion about genes and so forth. Now, it turns out there may be gremlins, right? But when she does science, she's just assuming this stuff. It's a different debate. Excuse me. So in order to do philosophy, we would be making a claim, right? Okay, only the natural world exists, right? That would be philosophical naturalism, right? So one of them is we're making a claim. That's philosophical naturalism. The other one is we're just doing science. We're going to assume that this is true, but it may not, or it may be true. We don't know. That is methodological naturalism. Okay. Now, why do we have this, right? Why does it matter whether or not we see events that are publicly available? Well, from a philosopher that I love named Wittgenstein, he has this analogy about how we can't see one another's thoughts or ideas. And he says, look, I've got a beetle in a box, right? And I can't show you my beetle, but I can tell you about it. Likewise, you have a beetle in your box. You cannot show me the beetle, but you can tell me about it. This is an analogy to the expression of our emotions or our communications with one another, right? I can't exactly show you exactly what's in my head. If somebody claims that they're psychic and they can read my mind, there's no way for us to actually zoom into their mind and then see the window of their mind and see them seeing my mind, right? Instead, we have to come up with other kinds of tests to determine whether or not this person is really perceiving something. Remember way back with the Patterson-Gimlin film that I've talked about a couple times here, we can't go back in time and look at what Bob Gimlin said happened. There's no way to do it. All that we have is this artifact from, such and such a time, such and such a date. And that's what we can investigate. We don't have anything else to look at, right? In my hometown in Redlands in 1968, there was a flying saucer that was apparently witnessed by over 200 people. We cannot go to the town of Redlands and look at these people and put a brain scanner on them and kind of pluck their memories out of their head, right? We can't do that. We can look at drawings that people made. So an artist rendered this picture in the daily facts of what this thing looked like and so forth, but we can't look at impressions. And so you can't do science on stories and impressions. So I am going to now clarify for you the difference between science and something called pseudoscience. Pseudoscience, notice the prefix here at the very top of the slide. It says pseudo, which is kind of like saying fake, right? So pseudoscience looks like science, but something about it lacks the method and essence of science. There's something about it that fails to meet the standard for scientific knowledge. It's kind of a sham, right? That's a way to think of the word pseudo, as a sham. Think of the big bad wolf, you know, trying to fool Little Red Riding Hood into thinking that the wolf is grandma, right? It's a sham, it's a fake. And so what happens with pseudoscience is you very often have people who believe in a body of knowledge, or they think an idea is correct, and they want that idea to have the status of science, but for any variety of reasons it falls below that standard. Now, we're going to talk about 3 themes that you find in pseudoscience. Before I get to those themes, I want to make something very clear. Science and pseudoscience is not a black and white thing. So it's not like you're going to come across clear instances of science and then clear instances of pseudoscience. You'll definitely have those. But the relationship between science and pseudoscience tends to be one along a spectrum, right? And things over here are maybe a little bit more scientific. And then as you move down the spectrum, notice these colors, right? The quality of that idea or research or body of knowledge begins to lessen as you move along a spectrum. So there are different pseudosciences. They all partake to some degree on these different themes. So the first one is ideas to evidence. The focus is on ideas so much that that focus overrides the evidence. In many cases, it can actually affect your perception of the evidence. The second theme is anecdotes as evidence. It's very normal for pseudoscientists to rely on a story to provide evidence for their claim rather than a clinical trial, right, or a double-blind study. And then lastly, the third thing I've got there is Galileo. It's a Galileo complex. Usually, pseudoscientists are aware of the fact that their field is outside of mainstream academic science, and oftentimes this is like cause for great consternation. They're very upset about it. And the usual response is, this stuff is real, but I'm like Galileo, and I'm so far advanced that the establishment can't handle it. For a variety of reasons, this is usually incorrect. Okay, so we're going to talk about a few different pseudosciences here. We'll talk about chiropractic medicine, which is right here, Bigfoot, homeopathy, and dowsing. Dowsing has to do with using rods to detect materials beneath the earth. But before I go on chiropractic, I want to give my little blanket assumption here. With regard to pseudoscience, I can tell you straight up, I have been to a chiropractor before. I was to a chiropractor 3 or 4 times in my life. One time I was in such pain I couldn't walk, and that chiropractor fixed me up and I walked out of his office, and I've never been so happy in all my life. The stuff that we talk about as pseudoscience may be something that is a feature of your life, right? I do actually have a close long-term friend who is a chiropractor. She went to school for it. She did the whole thing. And so I'm not here to tell you guys, oh, you have to hate chiropractors, or oh, you have to hate people who believe in homeopathy, or you have to hate Bigfoot people, or you have to like them. It's irrelevant. My goal here is to talk about these different forms of thought that are given the name pseudoscience and move forward from there. I'm not here to say, you know, your grandfather who's using those rods is wasting his time. he can do as he likes, right? It's simply not in the scope of my class to tell you whether these beliefs are right or wrong, but I can help you evaluate them alongside a scientific method that has been successful over time. Okay. Pseudoscience. Evidence and ideas get backwards. So let's start with Bigfoot, right? This happens a lot with Bigfoot. Now remember, we talked about how expectations can affect your perceptions. In order to give you what I think is a good example of a pseudoscience doing this, I want to talk to you about something called the Skookum cast. Okay, guys, so I'm going to show you now, in order to talk about the difference between science and pseudoscience, I'm going to show you a clip pertaining to the Skookum cast. It's an older clip. It lasts about 10 minutes, but I just encourage you to watch it now. It's going to appear right after me so that you can get some idea what the Skookum cast was, and then we'll talk about some particulars.
It's considered one of the most venerable forests in America. Covering more than 1 million acres, much of Gifford-Pinchot National Forest remains unexplored. And it's in these dense parts that some believe hides one of America's greatest legends. The hard part, though, is to find it. Animal X brings together an elite squad that thinks it has what it takes.
At this again, we were just about ready to leave when we noticed that the rest of this looked like it had hair in it. Hair imprints, and finally it dawned on us that this is something that isn't a bear. It sat down on its butt.
The team demonstrates the position they believe the creature lay in. From the indentations in the soil, they establish that it was big and heavy, laying down while reaching for the fruit. The excitement of the find filters through the team. A Bigfoot body imprint is a rare find, and the BFRO know it.
Get some tooth impressions.
Yeah, right.
It's huge. It's absolutely huge. I mean, a lot of footprints have been found, and in some cases a hand print and a knuckle print, but never a lower torso that can be studied by a primatologist.
This is one of the first times we may have proof, even without a picture, proof of DNA evidence of a North American ape.
Interestingly, the BFRO print revealed in Part 1 of Animal X was found in similar terrain to the Johnson sighting. Perhaps over time, the two incidents may help prove that a giant hominid creature lurks in these dense forests. The Pacific Northwest is largely unexplored, and some say the ideal hiding place for a giant ape. So, after a week's intense trekking in the area, could this elite team have found conclusive proof of Bigfoot?
Why wouldn't it be a bear? Because when a bear, when it goes to lay down, it will sit, roll, and get into the fetal position. Number two, a bear would not hardly ever come out into an open wallow like this and just lay down. No, a deer would not have sank anywhere near to the depth that this has sank.
Located in the Skookum Meadows area of the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, this 3.5 by 5 foot imprint is quickly tagged the Skookum cast by the Bigfoot Field Research Organization. So rare is a find of this nature that word spreads quickly. Media reports follow, as well as headlines on the internet. From first inspection, the BFRO is in no doubt of their find, gaining worldwide attention.
This is a body cast of a Sasquatch, which in my experience was a questionable animal for many, many, many years. My main interest is to try to convince the scientific community that this animal exists and should be more closely inspected.
Okay, so we're going to just take a second here. I know that wasn't super substantive, but it was some kind of video there to give you some idea of what the Skookum cast was. There are problems with the Skookum cast. As a form of evidence, there are problems, right? The first one is, why weren't any footprints found around the cast? Right? If the earth is soft enough to create the impression of somebody's hip or their butt, why wouldn't it also be able to make a measure of their feet, right? Now, there's a response to this from Bigfoot researchers, and the response is, well, the animal doesn't want to be detected, right? It's trying to kind of softly crawl over and then reach in and grab the fruit so that nobody knows that it's there. But, I mean, this is a self-defeating bit of logic. If the Bigfoot doesn't want to leave a mark or leave a trail of his presence there, then why would he kneel down and leave his butt impression or his knee impression in the mud? It doesn't make any sense. Also, and this is another thing that we need to be on the lookout for, and we'll see this later on in Roswell, what begins to happen now is you're asking, right, if you ask a Bigfoot theorist who thinks that the Skookum cast is good evidence, and you say, look, why aren't there footprints? And then that person says, well, there aren't footprints because the Bigfoot is very sneaky, right, and it's trying to keep itself hidden from you. Well, you're in big trouble right now, and that big trouble is now it looks like lack of evidence is actually evidence for your theory. And so now it looks like there's no way that you can either prove or disprove your theory. The reason why there isn't more evidence for Bigfoots is that they're very secretive. Okay, you know, it may well be true, but the problem is, as a rational thinker, I can't embrace a theory that treats the lack of evidence the same as evidence, right? And so this is just kind of a problem that pops up with the Skookum cast. So now what I want to talk about briefly with the Skookum cast is how your expectations or your idea can then overtake and overpower the evidence. So what I've done here is I've pulled up a picture of an elk, and you can see where somebody has mapped the points of the elk's anatomy to the points in the cast. And to a number of zoologists who've looked at this, they say, well, look, this looks pretty clearly like an elk to me. But remember that case we had involving ABC and 11, 12, 13, and it looked like the B in ABC could also be a 13 depending on the context and how things were framed? And whenever you saw that B the first time, it didn't look like, oh, this could be a B or a 13. Your brain just said to you, this is a B. And you thought it, well, the same thing is going on here with Bigfoot researchers, right? They have these expectations, these ideas are in their head. We maybe see some, right? Maybe a zoologist who looks at this sees, oh yeah, this is an elk's impression into the mud. But a Bigfoot researcher might say, I see the pattern of a Bigfoot here. And they may really see it, right? Remember that their brain may be making a decision for them without their knowing it. And so the brain says, this is absolutely a real Bigfoot impression. And that's what they see when they look at it. But what they're not getting is the information that their brain is throwing away or bypassing and saying, well, it looks like it could also be an elk. No, they get all that stuff gets washed away, and then to them it just looks like a real Bigfoot case. Let me show you an example here. Oops. Just say out loud what you see. Okay, so we're going to do this 3 times. The first 2 times, I would encourage you to say it out loud. Duck. 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 Oh, no, it's a rabbit. No, I'm just kidding. Okay. You notice how when I said duck, duck, boom, you want to say duck. You look at that, it looks like a duck. And that's because your brain has been primed for this, right? I've kind of led your expectations up to say duck, duck, duck. The same thing happens with Bigfoot researchers, right? They look at ideas, they have expectations concerning what a Bigfoot looks like, right? Wherever these things are drawn from. And so then they interpret their brain interprets new data, new stimuli in terms of its prior expectations. So suppose you're a park ranger, right? And you look at this picture. This was taken off of a trail in Pennsylvania. And when a park ranger looked at it, he said, yeah, those are a couple of bear cubs that are mangy, probably hungry, and they're walking around. A Bigfoot researcher sees it and says, Well, those are a couple of humpbacked Bigfoots just cruising around. Look, he's walking, he's striding. You can see it. This locomotion is very similar to a Bigfoot. Remember, what we see is the product of a lot of our brain's workings without our knowing. And so it's very natural. You can see why somebody who already believes in Bigfoot could look at this picture and say, gosh, that looks pretty conclusive to me, because it does look conclusive to them, because their brain is already making these decisions, right? And so if you were to come across tracks in the wilderness and you were convinced that Bigfoot exists, you might be more likely to identify tracks that you're not familiar with as Bigfoot tracks, as opposed to the more mundane or prosaic bear tracks, right? So what happens is sometimes our preconceived notions affect how we see evidence. And I think this has happened with the Skookum cast. You have a group of individuals, all of whom went out into the forest, and they were convinced they were going to find evidence of a Bigfoot. The last day before they leave, they find it, right? Now, this is strange. There should be more printing there. I don't know why there isn't. When the Skookum cast was discovered, Idaho State issued a press release concerning the find. Now, normally in an academic setting, if you were to have found something like this, you would do a study on it. And then you would submit that study for peer review. But in this case, in the Skookum cast case, there was no study done. Instead, there was a press release issued. Well, press releases are intended to communicate with the public, maybe to generate excitement about an event, or to clarify the nature of an event, or a corporation's position on something. But the point of a press release is not the systematic pursuit of truth. That would be a clinical study or some type of zoological or study on the cast. You would invite a bunch of people to look at the cast, which has not happened. The Bigfoot Research Organization keeps this cast under lock and key so other people can't investigate it. Why? If it is this fantastic evidence for the existence of Bigfoot, then you should be more than willing to share it with the world. I mean, this should be absolutely on the absolute priority list. You shouldn't be restricting it. So a way to think about this press release is it's really just an examination of the difference between a claim's form and its content. Well, here we're looking not at the content of what they're saying is in the Skookum cast, but we're looking at the form. And we're saying, well, gosh, normally these types of claims would be made in the following forms, meaning scientific communities in a very specific format so that other people can look at your findings, look at your evidence, and then give you feedback on it. Instead, they issue a press release. Now, I'm not saying that Meldrum or Idaho State is trying to put one over on anybody. These people all, I'm sure, are terribly sincere. But as a critical thinker, if I'm evaluating a source from the outside, I have to look at the form of the claim, right? I have to look at what's being said and ask myself, well, gosh, if this really is a legitimate scientific inquiry, why are you releasing, why is it a press release and not a study, right? Okay, so now we're going to talk about homeopathy. And this is a single idea that has a single story. It was started by Samuel Hahnemann, who, off the top of my head, he lived from 1755-ish in there to like the mid-1800s. And he had this idea. He was looking at the science of his day, and he found that he noted the creation of microbiology, and he was absolutely entranced with this idea that you could have this remarkably small dose of something, and that small dose would have this miraculously great effect. So you could make a vaccine, right? But the vaccine might be super duper small, but the effect that it would have in fighting illness would be profound. Well, this idea was really arresting to him, and so he was one of the people who started homeopathy off as an alternative medicine form. So I want to have Dr. Tony Pincus show you what homeopathy is with the Pincus potentizer. in this next clip.
What I'm going to do is to make the first dilution. This is the beginning stage of making a remedy. And in order to do that, I'm going to take 99 drops of alcohol, and I'm going to take my remedy, which is the arnica, and I'm going to add just 1 drop into this vial. There's 1 drop. And now I'm going to shake this very vigorously 20 times. And that has now become the first centesimal potency, which is the starting point, diluting it 1 part in 100 in each of the subsequent tubes. As we progressively dilute and shake, you can improve the effectiveness of the remedy and also take away the side effects. So it's a win-win situation.
By the time it has been diluted 12 times, it's highly unlikely a single molecule of the original droplet will remain. But according to the principles of homeopathy, the more dilute a preparation becomes, the more powerful it gets.
This machine, which is called the Pinker's potentizer, will allow us to make very high potencies. The dilutions go as high as 100,000 dilutions to 1 in 100. The dilutions go as high as 100,000 dilutions to 1 in 100, which is a phenomenal number of dilutions, but it's the highest potency that homeopaths tend to use. And that takes 14 days using a machine, but it could take months and months by hand.
Okay, so the idea here behind homeopathy is something like this. I take a compound and I put a certain amount of it in water, then I shake that water up and I continually dilute that original mixture until I get to the point where barely even 1 particle, even if that, of the original mixture remains. And somehow there's some kind of mechanism in the water, and that water somehow remembers the compound. It's not clear how this is done or how this works. In fact, it contravenes a number of laws that we know are true from physical chemistry and so forth. But the idea here is that somehow the water remembers the compound that it's part of. And so an example of why something like homeopathy would run into problems would be a reductio argument, right? Think about the Earth itself. It consists of about 70% of its surface is water. And that water, as it runs through our Earth, is cycled, right? So sometimes the water falls from the sky and ends up in us. We drink the water, right? And then, right, where does it come from? Well, it comes from the ocean. It comes from other locations where it evaporates. But as it's cycling around the Earth, moving through animals, moving through plants, it is mixing with other compounds which are also present in the water. And if homeopathy is correct, that water will retain the original image of whatever compound it was mixed with. So if that's true, and these medicines really were potent, then you would have people just taking drinks of water from a lake or a random drinking fountain, and suddenly they're just, right, they're completely slammed with some kind of homeopathic remedy that they had no idea was even there because, this drop of water that you drank from a water bottle once commingled with some other compound somewhere else, and now it's been so diluted, it's so strong, it slams right into you, right? That doesn't seem right. If your claim is that water somehow remembers the compound that it's mixed with, even if you dilute that water many millions of folds, then the entire Earth would be a massive chemical, it would be just all of the water would be a big, drug bonanza, right? Water mixes with all sorts of things, and if it does retain those compounds, then yeah, you'd be in a tough spot. Clearly that doesn't happen, right? People do get sick from drinking things that are in water, but they don't experience sort of these phantom homeopathic remedies because they're not there. The water doesn't leave this impression and so forth. So this is an example of a reductio, right? A reduced, the argument gets reduced to absurdity. Okay, so let's look at science and anecdotes from a little bit different angle. So consider this question. Clean gets sick with the flu and then drinks 1 gallon of macadamia nut oil. After that, he feels better. He then proclaims, see, macadamia nut oil cures the flu for everyone. Which of the following is a valid objection to Clean's claim? A, Clean could have gotten better from the flu anyway. All right, so if he says, right, so he gets sick, he drinks the oil, the macadamia oil, he says, I feel so much better, I'm cured, everyone should do this. If I want to respond critically to him, how could I do it? Well, let's look at these options. A, Clean could have gotten better from the flu anyway. Well, this is true. In fact, this happens very often. People will, they fail to realize that, right, after a couple of weeks, your cold will get better. And so if you took something during that time, it doesn't necessarily mean that whatever you took made you better, but the passage of time itself might have made you better. So that would be a good objection, right, to Clean's claim. B, Clean might have unique body chemistry and an immune system which makes his results unique. It certainly could happen. There are strange cases of people interacting in a very unusual way with drugs. Well, this may be one of those cases. He may be just someone whose immune system is quirky and it responds to macadamia nut oil. All of these options are valid objections. Yeah, they are now. I mean, so far A and B have been good, so let's hold off on C. D, Clean might have misdiagnosed himself. He might have had allergies or a cold instead of the flu. If so, that would make his claims about the macadamia nut oil and the flu wrong. E, confirmation bias. Someone may believe strongly in this product for other reasons and they're personally convinced that they're correct. E would actually be correct. We haven't covered confirmation bias yet, but this is true. Sometimes people believe in products or in the efficacy of a certain treatment for reasons that don't have anything to do with the efficacy of the treatment. And it may be that they trust the doctor or something like that. And in some cases, it does look like people's own mental states or beliefs about the efficacy of medical treatment can actually affect the treatment. It's too much to go into there, but any one of these options could be a valid objection. And so, you know, think about your own life, right? I remember I had a friend in New York who said that she took cod liver oil every single day and she had never been sick like in 20 years. Well, you know, good for you. I mean, if it's working for you, that's fine. But you have to realize one person taking a compound or a medicine does not generate enough evidence for the rest of us to take it. Why? Well, maybe this person got better anyway. Maybe this woman that I knew was going to be healthy for 20 years every day, regardless as to whether she took the cod liver oil. Maybe she just has a unique body chemistry, and this is the way it works. Maybe she just never gets sick, and so she's misdiagnosed that this is what's doing it. She just has this kind of immune system anyway. Or E, she just may believe very strongly in the cod liver oil, and that belief itself may mask some of her symptoms or prevent her from being more forthright about the effect of the product. Okay, so this is a way for us to start to think about the relationship of personal experience to evidence. And it looks like we're never going to quite, as individuals, be able to gather enough evidence from our personal experience to generalize universally. Instead, we can look at case studies involving hundreds of people, and that might give us some form of evidence that would be better than just someone saying, hey, I drank this oil and I felt better a week later. Okay, now I want to talk just briefly about something called iridology or iridology. I'm not sure on the pronunciation, so if you find out, please feel free to let me know. But the idea is Iridology, this is a chart. I don't know if we can see it here at the bottom. At the very tippy bottom, it says Iridology chart, developed by Dr. Bernard Jensen. Okay, copyright 1980. So, here's the idea. Iridology is this claim that you can actually investigate the eyes of a person, and on the basis of the appearance of their eyes, you can diagnose almost any medical condition that they have. And so this is a chart here that purports to show that this section of the eye relates to thyroids. This right here is the sensory cerebellum, or the physiological brain. And defects or appearances within the eyes reflect medical conditions that the body has. Now, I want to talk about iridology because of its basis. The basis for this pseudoscience is an experience that a young boy had in his backyard at the age of 11. And he was in his backyard, and somehow an owl had a broken wing or something, and he grabbed it to try and help it. And when he was grabbing it, they started to tussle, and apparently he broke its leg or something. He injured the animal while he was trying to help it. And he looked at the eye of the owl after this injury, and he saw that there was a spot there that he didn't think was there previously. And then as this individual went on, he became a doctor and so forth. He became convinced that you could diagnose people by looking at their eyes. Now, the basis for this is one single instance, right? So one event that occurred in this person's life, and that event, that occurrence, then formed the basis for the entirety of the discipline. The reason why it's only one event is because there's really not lots of evidence that this is true. The only case that we have is this personal report from a doctor, right? And so iridology is a great example of a pseudoscience that is beholden to one anecdote, one idea, and the basis of that one story, similar to chiropractic, is the basis for the entire discipline. This is unhealthy. You should have multiple instances of independently verified phenomena in order to start a legitimate branch of science, right? You can't just go off of one story from one kid at one point in the past. Okay, now that's just a brief story about iridology. I want to talk to you about the Galileo syndrome. The Galileo syndrome, I mentioned it earlier, but the idea is that some people who are interested in pseudoscience are very aware that they're not part of mainstream science. And so they feel that they have possession of truth or a set of truths that the scientific establishment doesn't want to acknowledge, or just the establishment in general doesn't want to acknowledge. Much like Galileo. Remember, Galileo was an astronomer who said, "Oh, I know that we have thought that the Earth is the center of the universe for so long, but when I actually observe the heavenly bodies up there, I can tell that the sun is actually the center of the universe or our galaxy." Probably didn't make that distinction at the time, but that the sun is the center of everything, not the earth. Well, the church didn't like this very much, right? It contradicted with some theological doctrines that they held at the time, and so they threatened Galileo, right, and all this. The idea here is the same for pseudoscience. So let me give you an example. There is an Atlantis theorist who thinks that plate tectonics is wrong. The reason why plate tectonics is wrong is because it's not compatible with the existence of Atlantis. And so forget any independent verification or any independent reasons we have for thinking that this is correct. If I want to believe in Atlantis, I cannot also believe in tectonics. So I have to advance a theory of Earth crust displacement. And this theory of Earth crust displacement leaves enough room for Atlantis to be real, but the scientific community will not accept it. And why won't they accept it? Well, because it... So if you are an Atlantis theorist and you need to explain why nobody accepts your Earth crust theory, you'd have to rely on suppression. And you'd have to say, well, the mainstream scientific community doesn't want anyone to know about this because all these professors would be out of a job. The U.S. government doesn't want you to know about, insert pseudoscience here, right? Usually in this case it would be Roswell, because da-da-da-da-da-da. Big Pharma doesn't want you to know about these herbal remedies because it would put them out of business. Well, no, right? Look, if there's a simple cure out there for something, I assure you, pharma would love to invent a profitable product around it. If there is some profound scientific truth that scientists don't know, they would love to hear it. If someone could disprove evolution or the theory of gravity or something like that today, and presented those findings to the scientific community, they would be famous. Science is built on disagreement and dissent. It's not built on uniformity. There are no science cops out there who say, oh no, you're not allowed to submit your findings, right? Not at all. People are excited about new findings and evidence that looks like it overthrows old theories because that's how we make progress in science. This is not to say that suppression by authority is impossible. It certainly could happen to someone. But the structure of science is built on dissent, and so this argument seems to be more ignorant of the nature of science than it is helpful. All right. Okay, and so now I just want to briefly close with dowsing. Dowsing is an attempt to locate water or oil or minerals or almost anything underground by the use of a rod. And they're usually just two rod irons like this. And the idea is as someone's walking along, there's some interaction with the energies of their body and the rods themselves, and the rods cross whenever they touch a target. Now, dowsing is a non-scientific endeavor. It's very, very old. There were probably dowsers in Egypt. At least it's my understanding there are pictorial representations of what looks like somebody carrying a rod. And this is a medieval wood carving of someone dowsing. So dowsing has been around for a long time. In fact, it's even still around now, right? So this is just an article from 2014 when we were absolutely in the middle of this awful drought in California. And boom, industry started trying to rely on water witches to try and find underground water. Well, look, there is no clinical data that dowsing works, but there are lots and lots of stories of people who claim to have had success. But when you put dowsers in these kinds of controlled conditions, and you can go to dowsers.org and see they have all kinds of meetings and stuff coming up, dowsers aren't very successful. And this strongly suggests that they're not actually using the mechanics of nature as we understand them. So why does this matter, right? You're probably at the end of this lecture going, oh, this thing has lasted so long. Why? Okay, here's why. You are looking at a soldier in Iraq use something called the ADE 651. It was sold as a bomb detection unit to the Iraqi government from a British foreign national or something. I don't remember the guy. But the price paid on these bomb detectors was $80 million. And these bomb detectors were just dowsing rods that did, wait for it, nothing. They did absolutely nothing. They had no electronics in them. They had no metrics of, no measurement metrics of any kind. They were just pieces of plastic and metal. And they even tried to train soldiers to use these to detect bombs. Well, these bomb detectors didn't work. And people were profoundly angry about this. And the guy who sold these to the Iraqi government actually went to jail. Look, this is a case where someone has a pseudoscientific idea and they're profiting off of it. at the loss of a considerable amount of money and lives, right? I mean, this isn't a joke. This is somebody's life, right? Lives have been lost because these Iraqi soldiers were using these bomb detectors and they didn't detect anything at all. So what I would encourage you guys to do, and I don't talk about this too much, but one of the reasons why the state of California wants you guys to learn about the difference between science and pseudoscience is the harm that results. So if you go to whatstheharm.net, you don't need to go, but if you go to whatstheharm.net, you'll see a number of cases where people have faced grave bodily injury or death or profound financial loss because they had bad scientific beliefs or pseudoscientific beliefs. And so you are welcome to, as I've mentioned many times in this course, you're welcome and entitled to your own beliefs. But the reason for this component of the education is so as to try to minimize your harm, right? So that you don't end up buying some of these products that don't work, that don't do anything. Okay, I hope this has been helpful. I'm actually going to cut this a little bit short here. We have a teensy bit to go to. I could do more after this, but it's been a super long video, and you guys have done a dynamite job at keeping up with me. So I want to thank you and review the notes. There are some points there that I almost lifted verbatim into your exam. If you guys have any questions at all, you know to email me, rvitt@lbcc.edu. Thanks a lot.